Time to rethink the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie. From the start, a common assumption was that this was a relatively amateur operation. Premeditated, yes, but not that sophisticated. Well, now there's a major new focus as the search nears week number 6. The FBI is now looking at internet outages around the time the 84-year-old disappeared. The new development comes as FBI agents head back to Guthrie's Tucson neighborhood and canvass residents there door to door. They're asking if anyone's internet went out that morning, the morning that Guthrie vanished. If so, it could have disabled their surveillance cameras during that critical time period and prevented them from recording what could be valuable evidence in Guthrie's case. This all comes as investigators zero in further on the doorbell camera video. It's really the only clue they have so far, capturing the masked suspect approaching Nancy's door. Here's what they're now focused on. See that small black device that was in the man's pocket? They're wondering if this could be a signal jammer, which the suspect could have used to cause an internet blackout. It's a theory that our own Brian Enton checked.
A quiet neighborhood in the Catalina Foothills of Tucson, Arizona, was still asleep when the flashing lights arrived. It was just after midday on Sunday, February 1, 2026. Deputies from the Pima County Sheriff's Department stepped out of their vehicles and slowly approached a house tucked along the foothills of the Santa Catalina Mountains. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. The front yard was still. The morning air was calm. Birds chirped in the distance. But just a few steps from the front door, one of the deputies suddenly stopped. Something on the ground caught his attention. There, on the porch of the home, investigators would later discover a dark stain. Blood. Moments later, officers began knocking on the door. No answer. Inside the house, something felt wrong. 84-year-old Nancy Guthrie, a retired teacher and mother of television journalist Savannah Guthrie, was nowhere to be found. Her phone was still inside. Her belongings had not been touched, and there was no sign that she had packed anything or left voluntarily. It was as if she had simply vanished. But the most chilling discovery was still waiting to be uncovered. Just hours earlier, sometime during the night of January 31, a surveillance camera in the quiet Tucson neighborhood had captured something disturbing. A lone figure, walking slowly through the darkness. The person wore dark clothing and gloves. A mask covered the face, and strapped to their back was a hiking backpack. Investigators would later say the individual appeared to be tampering with a security camera near Nancy Guthrie's home. But the footage raised a terrifying question. Was this masked stranger simply passing through the neighborhood? Or were they watching Nancy Guthrie? Because sometime after that moment was captured on camera, Nancy disappeared. And to this day, no one has been able to explain exactly what happened inside that quiet Tucson home. But as investigators began piecing together the timeline of that night, they uncovered something even stranger. The last person known to see Nancy Guthrie alive was someone she trusted, someone inside her own family. And the deeper investigators looked into the hours leading up to Nancy's disappearance, the more questions began to emerge. Questions that would soon turn a quiet Arizona neighborhood into the center of a nationwide search. And what investigators would uncover next would make the mystery even more disturbing. Welcome back here. In today's case, we're looking into the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie, the 84-year-old Tucson woman whose sudden vanishing sparked a massive investigation involving the Pima County Sheriff's Department and the FBI. But before we begin, do not forget to subscribe to our channel for more true crime stories like this. And tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Now let us get into it. The evening of Saturday, January 31, 2026, began like many other quiet nights in the Catalina Foothills area of Tucson, Arizona. The neighborhood, nestled against the desert landscape north of the city, was known for its calm streets, scenic mountain views, and a community where most residents had lived for years. It was the kind of place where neighbors recognized each other's cars, where unfamiliar activity often stood out quickly. Inside one of the homes in the neighborhood lived Nancy Guthrie, an 84-year-old woman who had spent much of her life as a teacher and a mother. Friends and neighbors described her as independent despite her age. She kept a routine that had changed little over the years. She attended church regularly, stayed connected with family, and maintained a quiet life in the home she had lived in for years. On that Saturday evening, Nancy spent time with family members. According to the timeline investigators later established, she had gone out earlier in the evening to visit relatives. Family gatherings like this were common, and nothing about the evening seemed unusual. Those who saw Nancy that night would later say she appeared in good spirits. She talked, laughed, and spent time catching up with the people closest to her. The evening moved along like many other family visits. Later that night, Nancy prepared to head back home. According to investigators, Nancy was driven back to her residence in the Catalina Foothills by her son-in-law, Tommaso Shini. This detail would later become important in the timeline of events because it established the last confirmed moment Nancy was seen alive. The vehicle arrived at Nancy's house just before 10 p.m. Security records from the home would later show that at approximately 9:48 p.m., the garage door opened as the car pulled into the driveway. Nancy exited the vehicle and walked inside her house. 2 minutes later, at around 9:50 p.m., the garage door closed. For investigators trying to reconstruct the timeline, that short moment would become critical. Because from that point forward, no one could say with certainty what happened next. Nancy was now inside her home, the lights were on, the house appeared secure. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet. The January desert air had cooled after sunset, and the streets of the Catalina Foothills were mostly empty. Residents had settled inside for the night. The area had little traffic after dark. But at some point during the night, something happened inside that home. Investigators would later believe that Nancy never left her house on her own. And something else would soon raise suspicion that an intruder had been nearby. In the days that followed, investigators reviewing security footage from the area discovered that a camera had captured an unknown person walking through the neighborhood late that night. The figure moved slowly through the darkness. The person appeared to be wearing dark clothing. A mask covered their face. On their back was a backpack. The footage was brief and grainy, but it was enough to raise serious questions. Who was this person? And what were they doing near Nancy Guthrie's home late that night? At the time Nancy arrived home, there was no sign that anything unusual was happening outside. The area was quiet. No neighbors reported hearing a disturbance. No alarms were triggered. Yet something inside the house would soon cause alarm. The next morning, Sunday, February 1, Nancy Guthrie did not follow her usual routine. For someone who had lived a structured life for decades, routine was important. Nancy typically stayed connected with her church and family. Missing scheduled activities was unusual for her. As the morning progressed, people close to her began to notice that something seemed wrong. Calls to Nancy went unanswered. Messages were not returned. At first, the concern was small. Sometimes elderly people missed a call or were resting. It was not uncommon for someone to take longer to respond. But as more time passed, the silence became harder to explain. Family members attempted to reach her again. Still nothing. By late morning, worry began to grow. Eventually, someone decided to check on Nancy directly. When they arrived at her home in the Catalina Foothills, the situation quickly became more troubling. The house was quiet. Nancy did not answer the door. Inside, there was no sign of movement. Her personal belongings appeared to still be inside the home. Her phone had not been taken. Nothing suggested that she had packed a bag or left voluntarily. This was the moment when the situation shifted from concern to alarm. Around midday on February 1, a call was made to report Nancy Guthrie missing. Deputies from the Pima County Sheriff's Department were dispatched to the home. When officers arrived, they began performing what initially appeared to be a routine welfare check. But as they approached the front of the property, something caught their attention. Near the front porch area, investigators noticed what appeared to be a dark stain. Upon closer examination, authorities believed the stain was blood. That discovery immediately changed the nature of the situation. What had first appeared to be a missing person case now raised the possibility that a crime had taken place. Investigators began securing the scene. Crime scene tape was placed around the property. Additional deputies and detectives were called in. Inside the home, investigators searched for signs that could explain Nancy's disappearance. The house did not appear to have been ransacked. There were no clear signs of forced entry. But Nancy was gone, and the blood outside suggested that whatever had happened may have occurred near the entrance to the house. The discovery quickly drew the attention of investigators across the region. Within hours, the Pima County Sheriff's Department began treating the situation as a possible abduction. Detectives started reconstructing the timeline from the night before. They spoke with family members. They gathered security footage. They searched the surrounding area. As the investigation began to expand, authorities would soon bring in federal assistance. Agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation joined the case, helping analyze evidence and coordinate search efforts. But even with those resources, one question remained unanswered. What exactly had happened inside Nancy Guthrie's home sometime after 9:50 p.m. on January 31? At that point in the investigation, detectives knew only a few things for certain. Nancy Guthrie had returned home safely that evening. She had entered her house, and sometime during the night, something had gone terribly wrong. As investigators began examining surveillance footage from the neighborhood, they discovered the figure captured on camera near the house. The masked individual with the backpack. For detectives trying to understand the case, that brief piece of video became one of the most important clues. Because if that person had been near Nancy's house at the right time, they might also be the last person who saw her alive. And identifying that person would become one of the most urgent priorities of the investigation. But as detectives soon learned, the mystery surrounding Nancy Guthrie's disappearance was only beginning to unfold. And the deeper investigators looked into the events of that night, the more complicated the case would become. By the afternoon of Sunday, February 1, 2026, the quiet neighborhood in the Catalina Foothills had transformed into an active crime scene. Deputies from the Pima County Sheriff's Department had already secured Nancy Guthrie's property, and investigators were beginning the long process of reconstructing what might have happened inside the home during the previous night. The early hours of any investigation are often the most critical. Detectives know that evidence can disappear quickly, memories can fade, and witnesses may overlook small details that later become essential. So the first priority for investigators was simple: secure the scene and gather every possible clue. Crime scene technicians moved slowly around the property, photographing the area and collecting samples. The dark stain discovered on the porch earlier was carefully documented and tested. Preliminary findings indicated that the blood belonged to Nancy Guthrie. That confirmation immediately intensified the investigation. If Nancy's blood had been spilled outside the home, it suggested that some form of struggle may have occurred near the entrance of the house. Investigators began looking closely at the walkway, the front steps, and the surrounding area for signs of movement, footprints, or other evidence. Inside the house, detectives began conducting a room-by-room search. The interior of the home appeared largely undisturbed. Furniture was still in place. Cabinets and drawers had not been ransacked. Personal belongings were where they were expected to be. Nancy's phone was still inside. So were many of her everyday items. For investigators, this detail mattered. In many missing person cases, people who leave voluntarily often take personal items with them, but Nancy appeared to have left behind everything she would normally need. That raised an unsettling possibility. Nancy may not have left the home by choice. As the search continued, investigators began examining the home's security system. Like many houses in the Catalina Foothills area, the property had cameras installed to monitor activity near the entrance. But when detectives attempted to review the footage from the front door camera, they noticed something unusual. The device appeared to have been tampered with. The camera had stopped recording during the night. At first glance, it was unclear whether the malfunction had been caused by a technical problem or by deliberate interference. But if someone had intentionally disabled the camera, it suggested that whoever approached the house may have known it was there. That realization raised the possibility that the crime may have been planned. As technicians worked to recover what little footage remained from the camera system, investigators began expanding their search beyond Nancy's property. Deputies went door to door throughout the Catalina Foothills neighborhood, speaking with residents and asking whether anyone had seen or heard anything unusual during the night of January 31. Neighbors were asked about unfamiliar vehicles, strange noises, or suspicious individuals in the area. Many residents reported that the night had been quiet, but a few mentioned something investigators found particularly interesting. Some homeowners said their internet connections had experienced interruptions during the night. At the time, it was unclear whether the reports were related to the case or simply routine technical problems, but detectives made note of the information. Meanwhile, investigators also began gathering surveillance footage from homes in the surrounding streets. Modern neighborhoods often contain dozens of cameras, doorbell cameras, driveway cameras, security systems installed by homeowners. Together, these devices can create a timeline of activity across an entire neighborhood. Detectives collected video recordings from several homes within a few blocks of Nancy Guthrie's house. It was during this review process that investigators discovered the footage that would soon become one of the most discussed elements of the case. A camera had captured a person walking through the area during the night. The video showed a figure moving slowly along the street. The person wore dark clothing. Their face was covered, and on their back was a backpack. The footage was brief and somewhat grainy, but the image was clear enough to raise concern. The person appeared to be moving toward the direction of Nancy Guthrie's home. Investigators carefully analyzed the timestamp attached to the recording. The individual had been captured on video during the same general time frame, when Nancy would have been inside her house after returning home earlier that night. This discovery quickly became a central focus of the investigation. Detectives began studying the video frame by frame, attempting to identify details about the individual. They estimated the person's height to be somewhere around 5 feet 9 inches to 5 feet 10 inches tall. The backpack appeared to resemble a common outdoor hiking pack. Although the footage did not clearly reveal the person's identity, investigators believed the individual's behavior was suspicious enough to warrant further examination. Authorities began working to determine whether the person had been seen on any other cameras in the area. They searched for additional footage that might show the individual arriving or leaving the neighborhood. Meanwhile, the Pima County Sheriff's Department made the decision to involve federal authorities in the case. Within a short time, agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation joined the investigation. The FBI often becomes involved in cases where a possible kidnapping or abduction has occurred, particularly when there is evidence suggesting that a crime may have crossed state lines or involved organized planning. FBI agents began assisting with forensic analysis, digital evidence recovery, and the examination of surveillance footage. At the same time, search teams were deployed throughout the area. Helicopters flew over nearby desert terrain. Officers searched nearby roads, open land, and surrounding neighborhoods. Volunteers from the community also began offering assistance. The disappearance of Nancy Guthrie had quickly drawn attention across Tucson. Local news outlets began reporting on the investigation, describing the missing 84-year-old woman and the circumstances surrounding her disappearance. As the case gained wider coverage, detectives continued building the timeline. They spoke with Nancy's family members to determine her routine and any recent changes in her life. According to those closest to her, Nancy had not expressed fear or concern about anyone in the days leading up to her disappearance. There had been no known threats, no reported conflicts, no obvious reason for someone to target her. That fact made the case even more puzzling. As investigators examined the timeline of January 31, they confirmed that Nancy had spent the evening with family before returning home around 9:48 p.m. After that moment, the timeline grew uncertain. The only clue suggesting that someone might have approached the home during the night was the figure captured on surveillance footage. Detectives began asking a series of questions. Was the person in the video connected to Nancy's disappearance? Had they been watching the home? Had they entered the property sometime after Nancy returned inside? Or was the individual simply someone passing through the area with no connection to the case? At that stage of the investigation, authorities did not yet have the answers. But they knew that identifying the person in the video could be the key to understanding what happened. In the days that followed, investigators prepared to release the footage to the public. They hoped that someone might recognize the individual or provide information that could help identify them. Because if the masked person seen walking through the Catalina Foothills neighborhood that night had any connection to Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, then that brief moment captured on camera might represent the only visual record of the person responsible. And as the investigation moved into its next phase, detectives would soon uncover additional clues that raised even more questions about what had taken place inside the home on the night Nancy Guthrie vanished. By the time investigators moved into the next phase of the investigation, the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie had already begun attracting national attention. What started as a local missing person case in Tucson, Arizona was quickly developing into a mystery that stretched far beyond the quiet streets of the Catalina Foothills. In the days following February 1, detectives continued building the timeline of events surrounding Nancy's disappearance. Every small detail from the previous night was being examined carefully. Investigators reviewed security footage repeatedly, interviewed neighbors, and searched for any clue that could explain what happened between the moment Nancy entered her home at approximately 9:48 p.m. on January 31 and the moment her family reported her missing the following day. One of the most important pieces of evidence remained the brief surveillance footage, showing the masked individual walking through the neighborhood. As investigators studied the video more closely, they began noticing behavior that seemed unusual. The person did not appear to be walking casually through the area. Instead, their movements seemed deliberate. The individual was dressed in dark clothing from head to toe, Their face was covered, and they carried what investigators believed to be a black hiking backpack. The backpack quickly became a key detail. Investigators believed it might have been used to carry tools or equipment that could have helped someone enter the house or disable security devices. Because as detectives examined the footage from Nancy's doorbell camera, they became more convinced that the device had been intentionally tampered with. The camera had stopped recording during the night, and based on what investigators could see in the limited footage that remained, the masked individual appeared to be standing near the camera shortly before it stopped functioning. If that interpretation was correct, it meant that whoever approached the home may have attempted to disable the camera before doing anything else. For detectives, that detail suggested planning. Someone who intended to commit a crime would likely want to avoid being recorded, and disabling the camera would have been a logical first step. As investigators continued reviewing footage from other homes in the Catalina Foothills neighborhood, they searched for additional sightings of the masked individual. They hoped to determine where the person had come from and where they went after leaving the area. But finding additional footage proved difficult. Some cameras had not captured clear images. Others had recorded nothing unusual. Then another unusual detail began to emerge. While speaking with residents throughout the neighborhood, detectives learned that several people had experienced internet disruptions during the same night Nancy disappeared. At first, these reports did not seem significant. Internet outages are not uncommon, especially in residential areas. But as investigators compared the timing of these reports with the estimated time frame of Nancy's disappearance, the possibility of a connection became harder to ignore. Some residents told detectives that their home security cameras had gone offline temporarily. Others reported that their wireless connection stopped working for a short period during the late-night hours. For investigators, this raised a new question. Could someone have intentionally interfered with the neighborhood's internet signals? One possible explanation involved the use of a device known as a signal jammer. Signal jammers are capable of blocking wireless signals within a limited area. If someone used such a device, it could potentially disable cameras, alarm systems, and other wireless technology. While investigators had not yet confirmed whether such a device had been used, the possibility was taken seriously. If the suspect had deliberately disrupted the neighborhood's cameras and internet connections, it would suggest that the crime had been carefully planned. Meanwhile, the investigation continued to expand. The Pima County Sheriff's Department worked closely with the FBI to analyze digital evidence. Technicians examined Nancy's electronic devices, searching for any unusual communications or suspicious activity. They also analyzed phone records and location data in an effort to determine whether any unfamiliar devices had been near Nancy's home that night. At the same time, investigators continued interviewing family members and acquaintances. They asked questions about Nancy's routine, her relationships, and whether she had experienced any problems or conflicts recently. According to those closest to her, Nancy had lived a quiet life. She maintained regular contact with her family. She attended church. She spent time with relatives and friends. There had been no indication that she felt threatened or concerned about her safety. That made the case even more puzzling. Why would someone target an 84-year-old woman living alone in a quiet neighborhood? Was the suspect specifically targeting Nancy? Or had something else happened that night? As detectives worked through these questions, they also considered the timeline involving Nancy's final known movements. The last confirmed person to see Nancy alive was her son-in-law, Tommaso Shini, who had driven her home earlier that evening. Investigators spoke with him as part of their routine interviews. Shinny explained that he had dropped Nancy off at her home shortly before 10 p.m. and then left the area. According to the timeline reconstructed by investigators, Nancy entered the house, and the garage door closed shortly afterward. After that moment, no one had seen or spoken to her. Detectives also confirmed that Nancy had not made any phone calls or sent any messages later that night. For investigators, this meant that whatever had happened likely occurred sometime between Nancy entering her home and the following morning. As days passed without answers, the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie began drawing increasing media attention. News outlets across Arizona reported on the case. Then national networks began covering the story as well. Nancy's daughter, television journalist Savannah Guthrie, became a visible figure in the search effort, speaking publicly about the investigation and asking for help from anyone who might have information. The case quickly spread across social media. People across the country began discussing the mysterious footage of the masked individual seen walking through the Catalina Foothills neighborhood. Some viewers speculated about the identity of the person. Others wondered whether the figure might have been watching Nancy's home before entering the property. But investigators remained cautious. At that stage, they had not yet confirmed that the individual seen in the footage was directly responsible for Nancy's disappearance. Still, detectives knew that identifying that person could be critical to solving the case. As the investigation continued, another development would soon introduce a new layer of complexity. Messages began appearing that claimed Nancy had been kidnapped. The messages demanded money for her release. At first, investigators could not immediately determine whether the messages were legitimate. If they were real, it would mean that Nancy was still alive and that someone was attempting to extort money from her family. But if the messages were false, they could represent a disturbing attempt by someone to exploit the situation. Detectives quickly began working to trace the origin of the messages. Because if the person sending them was connected to Nancy's disappearance, they might finally be able to identify the individual responsible. But as investigators soon discovered, the messages would lead them down a path that complicated the case even further. And the truth behind those communications would soon raise even more questions about what had happened to Nancy Guthrie on the night she vanished. By the time the investigation entered its next stage, nearly 2 weeks had passed since the night Nancy Guthrie disappeared from her home in the Catalina Foothills of Tucson, Arizona. Despite the growing involvement of federal authorities, the expanding search efforts, and the intense public attention surrounding the case, investigators still had very few answers. What they did have was a timeline that raised troubling questions. Nancy had returned home at approximately 9:48 p.m. on January 31, 2026. The garage door closed shortly afterward, marking the last confirmed moment she was seen alive. By midday the next day, her family had reported her missing after discovering she was not responding to calls and had failed to follow her usual routine. Investigators had already discovered blood near the front porch of the house and had begun analyzing surveillance footage that showed a masked individual moving through the neighborhood during the night. But just as the investigation appeared to be focusing on that mysterious figure, another unexpected development complicated the case even further. Several days after Nancy disappeared, messages began appearing that claimed she had been kidnapped. The communications demanded money in exchange for her safe return. At first, the possibility of a ransom demand immediately changed the direction of the investigation. If the messages were legitimate, it meant that Nancy might still be alive and being held somewhere by the person responsible for the abduction. Law enforcement officials began working quickly to determine whether the messages were genuine. Investigators carefully analyzed the content of the communications and the method used to deliver them, Some of the messages had been sent to media outlets and investigators rather than directly to the family, which immediately raised concerns about their authenticity. The person sending the messages demanded payment in cryptocurrency, which is often used in ransom cases because transactions can be difficult to trace. However, detectives quickly noticed several inconsistencies. Deadlines mentioned in the messages passed without any additional communication. Certain details contained in the messages did not match information that investigators believed the real suspect would know. As the investigation into the messages continued, authorities eventually identified the individual responsible for sending them. The person behind the communications was not connected to Nancy's disappearance. Instead, investigators determined that the individual had attempted to exploit the situation by pretending to be involved in the crime. The person had hoped to receive money by convincing others that they were holding Nancy hostage. Once law enforcement confirmed that the messages were fraudulent, the situation created both frustration and concern among investigators. False ransom claims are not uncommon in high-profile cases, but they can divert valuable time and resources away from the real investigation. For detectives working to locate Nancy Guthrie, the discovery meant that the messages had provided no useful information about where she might be or who had taken her. The case returned to its earlier focus. Investigators once again turned their attention to the evidence collected at Nancy's home and the mysterious figure captured on surveillance footage. Meanwhile, search efforts continued across the Tucson area. Law enforcement officers conducted ground searches in nearby desert terrain, examining open land and remote areas surrounding the Catalina Foothills. Helicopters scanned the landscape from above, while teams of volunteers assisted in searching neighborhoods and nearby roads. Despite these efforts, investigators did not locate any trace of Nancy. The absence of physical evidence beyond the blood discovered near the porch made the case especially difficult to solve. Detectives continued examining every possible lead. They analyzed phone records, reviewed traffic camera footage, and searched for any unfamiliar vehicles that may have entered the neighborhood during the night Nancy disappeared. They also continued examining the possibility that the masked individual seen on video might have been responsible for the crime. One key detail investigators focused on was the backpack carried by the individual in the footage. The bag appeared to resemble a type commonly sold in outdoor supply stores. Detectives worked with retailers and manufacturers to determine whether the backpack could be identified more specifically. If the item could be traced to a particular store or region, it might help narrow the search for the suspect. At the same time, investigators continued looking into the reports of internet disruptions that neighbors had experienced during the night of January 31. Technicians examined network data and attempted to determine whether any unusual electronic interference had occurred in the area. While investigators had not yet confirmed whether a signal jammer had been used, they considered the possibility that someone might have attempted to disable cameras and security systems before approaching Nancy's house. If that theory proved correct, it would indicate that the crime had been carefully planned. Meanwhile, public interest in the case continued to grow. News outlets across the country reported on the mysterious disappearance of Nancy Guthrie. The case drew attention not only because of the unusual circumstances, but also because of Nancy's connection to her daughter, television journalist Savannah Guthrie. Savannah Guthrie spoke publicly about the case, expressing concern for her mother and asking anyone with information to come forward. The family also announced that a large financial reward would be offered for information that could help locate Nancy or identify the person responsible for her disappearance. The reward quickly reached $1 million. For investigators, The hope was that someone who knew something about the crime might come forward. Sometimes cases like this are solved not through physical evidence, but through information provided by witnesses or individuals connected to the suspect. But even with the reward in place and national attention focused on the case, weeks passed without a breakthrough. The masked figure seen walking through the Catalina Foothills neighborhood remained unidentified. No one had reported seeing Nancy after the night she returned home. And despite the extensive search efforts conducted across Tucson and surrounding areas, investigators had still not located any sign of where she might be. As the investigation continued, detectives faced a troubling reality. They had a missing woman, a brief video of a masked individual near the house, and evidence suggesting that a struggle may have occurred near the entrance of the home. But they still did not know exactly what had happened inside the house that night. And until investigators could identify the person seen in the surveillance footage or uncover new evidence explaining Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, the mystery surrounding the events of January 31, 2026 would remain unsolved. For Nancy's family, the search continued. And for investigators, the hope remained that someone knew something about the night Nancy Guthrie vanished from her home in Tucson. As the investigation into Nancy Guthrie's disappearance moved into its next phase, weeks had already passed since the quiet night when she returned to her home in the Catalina Foothills of Tucson, Arizona. What began as a welfare check on February 1, 2026 had grown into a complex investigation involving the Pima County Sheriff's Department, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and numerous search teams working across southern Arizona. Despite the attention, the search for answers had become increasingly difficult. Investigators had gathered evidence from the home, reviewed surveillance footage from the surrounding neighborhood, and interviewed neighbors, family members, and potential witnesses. Yet the case remained surrounded by uncertainty. The central question remained the same as it had been from the beginning. What happened to Nancy Guthrie sometime after she entered her home at approximately 9:48 p.m. on January 31? Detectives continued revisiting the evidence they had collected during the first days of the investigation. The blood discovered near the front porch remained one of the most concerning clues, suggesting that some form of struggle may have occurred outside the home. The surveillance footage showing a masked individual walking through the neighborhood continued to draw attention from investigators and the public alike. But despite repeated efforts to identify the person seen in that video, the individual remained unknown. The investigation moved forward through a combination of forensic analysis, interviews, and extensive searches. Ground teams combed through desert terrain surrounding the Catalina Foothills, examining washes, trails, and remote areas where evidence might have been left behind. Helicopters assisted with aerial searches, while investigators expanded their search radius beyond the immediate neighborhood. Detectives also continued analyzing digital evidence, including electronic devices belonging to Nancy and others who had been in contact with her during the days before her disappearance. Phone records, location data, and online communications were reviewed carefully in an effort to identify any unusual activity. Meanwhile, law enforcement officials continued working with the public, hoping that someone might provide information that could move the case forward. The disappearance of Nancy Guthrie had by this time drawn national attention. News organizations across the United States reported on the case, describing the mysterious circumstances surrounding the disappearance of the 84-year-old woman from Tucson. As coverage increased, Nancy's family made public appeals asking for help. Savannah Guthrie, Nancy's daughter and a television journalist known to viewers across the country, spoke about her mother and the ongoing search. In interviews and public statements, she expressed both concern and hope that someone with information might come forward. Family members described Nancy as a caring mother and grandmother who had lived independently and maintained close relationships with the people around her. They emphasized that Nancy had not been someone who would disappear without explanation. Her routine had been consistent. Her connections with family and friends were strong. For them, the idea that Nancy had simply vanished without a trace was impossible to accept. As the investigation continued, the family and their supporters announced a large financial reward for information that could help solve the case. The reward eventually reached $1 million. Law enforcement officials hoped that such a significant amount might encourage someone with knowledge of the events to come forward. In some cases, investigators rely on tips from the public to identify suspects or uncover new leads. Even small details can sometimes provide the breakthrough needed to solve a complex case. Despite the reward and the continued attention surrounding the investigation, however, weeks passed without a clear resolution. Detectives continued revisiting the timeline again and again. Nancy returned home on the evening of January 31. The garage door closed shortly before 10 p.m. At some point during the night, something happened. By the following morning, Nancy was gone. The masked figure captured on surveillance footage remained the most mysterious element of the case. Investigators continued analyzing the video in hopes of identifying the person's clothing, movements, or equipment. The backpack seen in the footage also continued to draw attention. Detectives attempted to determine whether it could be connected to any specific store or brand that might help trace its origin. Meanwhile, investigators remained cautious about drawing conclusions. They had not publicly confirmed whether the individual seen in the video was responsible for Nancy's disappearance, but they acknowledged that the person's presence near the home during the night remained suspicious. As the search continued, the case raised difficult questions about safety, planning, and the possibility that someone had deliberately targeted Nancy. Was the masked individual simply passing through the area? Or had the person approached the house intentionally? If the crime had been planned, how long had the suspect been preparing? And why Nancy? These questions remained unanswered. For investigators, solving the case depended on discovering new evidence or identifying the individual captured on camera. For Nancy's family, the focus remained on finding her and understanding what had happened. The passage of time often makes investigations more difficult, but detectives continued working the case, reviewing evidence and following every lead that emerged. Even as weeks turned into months, the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie remained one of the most troubling mysteries to emerge from the Tucson area. The quiet neighborhood where she had lived continued to appear unchanged to those passing through. The desert landscape surrounding the Catalina Foothills remained as calm as it had been on the night Nancy returned home. But behind that calm setting remained an unanswered question. Somewhere, someone likely knows what happened inside that house on the night of January 31. Someone may know why Nancy Guthrie disappeared. And someone may know where the masked individual seen walking through the neighborhood came from and where they went after leaving the area. Until those answers are found, the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie remains an open investigation. For detectives, the case continues. For Nancy's family, the search continues. And for the community that once knew her as a quiet neighbor living in the Catalina Foothills of Tucson, the hope remains that one day the mystery of what happened on that January night will finally be solved. Tonight, the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie remains an open mystery. An 84-year-old woman returned to her home in the Catalina Foothills of Tucson, Arizona on the night of January 31, 2026. Just hours later, she vanished. investigators found blood near the entrance of her home. Security footage captured a masked individual moving through the neighborhood in the darkness. Neighbors reported unusual activity that same night. Yet despite weeks of investigation, searches across the desert, and the involvement of both local authorities and federal agents, the most important questions remain unanswered. Where is Nancy Guthrie? Who was the person seen walking through that quiet neighborhood in the middle of the night? And what really happened inside that home after the garage door closed at 9:50 p.m.? Cases like this often leave behind silence where answers should be. But history has shown that many investigations are eventually solved because someone chooses to speak up. Someone notices a detail they once overlooked. Someone recognizes a face, a voice, or a piece of information that suddenly makes sense. And sometimes, the smallest piece of information becomes the key that unlocks the entire truth. If you have followed this case with us tonight, take a moment and think about what you believe may have happened. Do you think the masked individual captured on surveillance footage holds the key to solving this mystery? Or do you believe there may be more to the story that investigators have yet to uncover? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective might help bring attention to details that others may have missed. And if you are interested in real criminal investigations like this one, cases that remain unsolved, cases that raise difficult questions, and cases that continue to impact families and communities, make sure to subscribe to this channel. Every week we explore real true crime stories, examining the evidence, the timelines, and the mysteries that investigators are still trying to solve. Your support helps bring attention to these cases and keeps the conversation going. Because sometimes, awareness is what keeps a case alive. And for families still searching for answers, keeping a case alive can mean everything. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next case.